Hey, let's see how we can create a chart like this that has coordinated views in D3. Basically, the whole idea is that I have a weird chart, as you can see in here, that allow us to take a data set and look at it on an overview and then select something from that overview and see more details, like in an at least more expand way. So this is a common pattern called eagle eye, or at least that's usually how I see it. And in this data set is quite interesting because it allows you, these are different flights from different airports. And I'm looking the distances and what is the delay on them on x-axis. When you select a small piece like this, then you can see that actually there are some holes in there that might be with something due to the distances between the different airports. So it's quite interesting that there's like these gaps in there that are not visible when you're looking at the overview in this one. So for building this, we are going to do several steps. Like the first one, it's that we are going to be reusing this reusable, brushable scatter plot pattern that it's on itself a fork of the reusable chart pattern. So first, we are going to build this using this pattern. And then after that, I'm going to try to show you how I built this one based on the other one. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is that we're going to create a new observable, as we see in here, and let's say in here D3 coordinated views. And then we need to start by importing D3. So I'm going to get D3 version 6. And we also need some data. So let's say that we are going to include the Vega datasets. That is Vega datasets here. So out of that, I think we should stick this to version 2. So with that, we can get some data that is going to be our Vega datasets on the flights. I think it's how it's that one called. There we go. So let's get this 10K one. We can get it like this. Oops. And then call it as a function. So this is a sample of the data. It's 10,000 rows. And as you can see, one of the rows is a date. So I'm going to hope that that's actually coming in the right format. And I'm going to try to parse that. So basically what I'm going to do is that I'm going to wait for this to finish. Once it finishes, then I'm going to map over the elements and of course make a mistake, and then I'm going to say that the date, it's going to be passing the date through the dot date. Okay, and then I'm going to return D. And finally something that let's do it later when we face the problem. So now that we have this, then we have some data and then we can show it. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to import this notebook. So on the beginning, I am just going to say in here, I'm going to import, and I think the chart module in there, it's called chart. And then I'm going to get that from this. So when you go and check this module, what that thing updates, then you're going to see that this is different from the examples that MyGusto creates in the way that this is creating like a kind of like a class, like a module that I can instantiate and then look at it from or use it to create like multiple views like this one here. So I'm going to use that one. And then the way you use those charts is that you need to have a place where you wanna draw. So you can say something like, I'm going to create a div in here, and then let's call this my div or whatever, and then I can just return that div. So basically, remember, this is like creating some HTML, and I am going to create two elements in there. Or actually, one of the things I'm going to do is that since I want to have things side by side, there is a new CSS property called flex that allows you to do just that. So I'm going to create two divs in here, and again, this is just for demonstration purposes. So if you have a more real case scenario, like call this overview, and then let's call the other one detail. So we have that one, so we have these elements, and then what you do in here is that you create one chart, and then let's call that overview. And for creating that chart, you just say, I'm going to create a new chart. And you need to say what are going to be the attributes that you're going to be using. So if you take a look at how I'm creating the charts in here, like this will have some accessors for establishing the X, the Y, and also the onBrush, that it's going to be a method for whenever someone brushes over the chart. So basically it will be something like, for this, we were using delay versus duration, I think is the other one. And then starting with that, we can just say that we are going to select our div, and then out of that div, and let's call this selection or something, and then we can say out of this one we can select our overview, and that it's an ID that we use in there. And then we just need to say what is the data for this one. So since this is only going to be one element, then we can say it's datum. And then having done that, I can just call overview in there. And just like that, you get a chart. And then of course, I made a mistake, I think, is delay versus distance. So that variable doesn't exist. And now we have a chart, okay? So since I want to create two of those, then what I can just do is duplicate these things. So I'm going to crawl these details, and then I just need to change this one and say in here that I am going to be selecting details. Did I call it like that? Detail. And then in here I'm going to show the details. So with that, now you have two charts. So since I want to show them side by side, then one of the tricks I can do is that I can also change. Oh, interesting. This is a mistake. This should be something like this, because it's a CSS rule. And then in this one, I'm going to say that the width is going to be for this one like 30%. And for the other one, let's say the remaining 70%. So hopefully with that, now you have the two charts, and then one has less space. So this module that I have in here is quite dumb, so you still have to tell it like what is the width and height that you want. So in this case, I want this divided by 3, I think, and the height, let's say that it's going to be the same thing. And for the other one, let's say that is going to be multiplied by 2/3, and then now you have one small one and the other one it's a big one. So this is really nice because you have like this brush, and then actually since we are using the same module, this one also has a brush, but then I can come in here and then select something, and I want this other one to update. So the way I implemented that is that I created an onBrush method in here, and what that one does is that I call like a selected element in here, and that one will contain all of the rows that are selected by the brush, and I'm going to be using the overview as my master, in a way of calling it. And then basically what I want is to like update the detail, right? So update detail. So, but if you think about it, like this is the way that you're actually drawing your detail. So we can, one way of implementing this is that I'm going to take this part, since I need that to already exist when I'm calling that, then I'm going to be doing in here overview, and then I'm going to I can just paste this code in here. So I can put that in there. So basically what this is going to be doing is that every time I update that thing, then this is going to be updating, and only it's going to be showing the selected ones. So the beauty of that is that just by doing that, then you get something like this, which actually has a very interesting animation that you see in there. And the problem with that is that every time I'm selecting something new, then D3 is kind of like changing all the points in order, and you don't want that to happen. That is very typical when you're doing data binding, because D3 is going to do the binding by the index if you don't tell it what is the ID that you're going to be using. So that is the problem that I was struggling or hesitating before in here, if I should add it or not. So now that you see it, now I'm going to create an index, which by the way is going to be the position in the data set, but it's going to be fixed. So rather than in this case where I say have 300, then they're going to have new indexes. So now I have an index that I can use an ID, and I actually modify my reusable pattern to say that I'm going to be using ID as my selector. And you need to pass that. Actually, the most important one is in here, because this is the one that needs to define which one is which. So now that we have done that, I think it's a little bit better. The animation is still wrong. So if my bus talk sees this, it's going to say that it doesn't like that the dots are not appearing in the position. Actually, like the animation, it's a little bit detrimental in here, because like the dots are staying put. But just for demonstration purposes, I think it kind of helps a little bit. Okay, so as you can see, the way of creating faceted views with D3, the key of that, it's how you handle your HTML. If you search for other examples, like for instance, Mike Bostock created some examples that I hadn't seen probably very recently, and this one is one of those. So when you actually look at this brushable splum, the way he did this one, it's just in one block of D3. So I actually like doing this on separate blocks. So as you can see, if you take a look in the lower part of my example in here, then you can see that I have an example on how to create a splum using one of the reusable patterns. Like for instance, in the brushable one, it's weird because now we have this one, but they're not connected. So it will be a matter of connecting them. But if you do this, then it's risky because now you have two brushes. So as you see, when you start adding these features, then you have to start taking into account those considerations. Like the way Mike Bostock handled that in here is that every time he creates a new brush, then he clears previous brushes from everything else. And since he is doing that across, like in one simple chart, then in one big chart rather, then it's easier to do that. So all of those are considerations that you have to keep in mind when creating something like this. So now that we have this, let's try to see how I added, like if you want to see more details, how I added a brush to this reusable chart pattern. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to fork this one, and then I'm going to put it into the Berkeley theme. And before I forget, let me share this with the view and put this one in the Scratchbooks. Yes, I am that forgettable. I forget a lot. How do you say that in English? So anyhow, so I have the reusable chart pattern, and it doesn't have the ID as you can see in here, and it doesn't have the brush. So if you want and you want to add the brush, then there is a ton of examples that Mike has for this. Like actually, like this original one, he has, I wonder if I can see it here, brushable scatter plot. So this one. So this is one of the official ones, and it's actually quite nice code that you have in here for the brushable part. So if you expand the code in here, then you're going to see that there are like 2 or 3 parts that you need to add. First, you need to create the brush, okay? And when you do that, then you have to say what is going to be the method that you're going to be using for handling the event of the brush. Then you need to create a G where you're going to be adding that thing. Actually, this is interesting. So Mike Bostock is adding it in here in the whole SVG. So you have to decide where you're going to be doing that. And then you need to have like an example like this, or a handler like this, that what it's going to do is take the selection and then filter using whatever it's passed on that selection. So actually, let me show you some other examples that he has. in here, there is one that I really like, that it's close to this one. This one. So actually this one I like it because instead of putting the G directly on the SVG, he's putting that in a separate G. So this is the G for the brush. So let's work from there. So I guess it's going to be this one. So, and then let's start by changing this. So let's say brushable reusable chart. Okay. So the first thing we are going to do is to create the brush. Okay, so I'm going to do that in here. I'm just going to say I'm going to create a D3 brush, and then you need to say what are going to be like the methods that handle that. So usually you have 3 methods that you can handle with brushes. You have start, brush, and end. And then if you just pass them like this, I think you can say what is going to be the event handler for all of them together. So in this case, all of them are going to trigger exactly the same one. Okay. So the other one that you can do is that you can say what is going to be the extent of this, and I think this takes an array of tuples, like a tuple of tuples. That's going to say from where to where it's going to be your brush. So in this case, it's going to be from 0, 0 to width minus margin left minus margin right, that I actually have in there as I width, but not public outside. So I'm actually going to put it like this. Then height minus margin top minus margin bottom. Okay. So once I have done that, then it's complaining that it doesn't have the function brushed. So the function brushed, it's going to take an event, and that's something that changed between D3 version 6 and version 5, is that in version 5 you used to access the event using D3 event. In version 6 you are supposed to get it directly as an event handler, and then you can get the selection just from the event selection. And then what you need to do is that if your selection exists, then that means that something was selected, and then you can just pass that in here. So let's say that you just do console log selected, and then I'm going to say here is my selection. Okay. So the other thing is that I actually need to call this brush. I need to append something. So if you remember this pattern, like the key of this pattern is that it has a part that it's actually included on the enter part of the join. So if you go in here, and then you're going to see that like it has this key where it tries to add an SVG, and then you can set and say for the enter I want to do these things. So every time you need to do an append, that should go in here. So I actually left a nice note in here reminding me that forgetful, that's what I was looking for, because I'm very forgetful. So what you need to do in here is just say I'm actually just going to call the brush in here. You can use add like a class if you want, and let's say this is going to be my brush. One of the keys of this is that actually your brush I think should be the element that is in the topmost of your chart, because otherwise it's going to be behind some of the other ones, and then it's not going to work. So when we do that, the other way of guaranteeing that, and I'm not sure if this is necessary, but I'm going to create another G in here, and I'm going to give it a class marks. And then basically what I'm going to do is that when I create my marks, I am going to do them in this one. So I'm going to select first the marks, and then inside that I'm going to do this one. So now that I have done that, then I can reload this one, and then let's inspect here in the code and see how this end up going. So actually you can see we have a brush, and now I can do this thing. And when you brush, it's actually telling you what are the coordinates that is going. So far, so good. Okay. One of the only things that worries me is that, remember that this chart is adjustable. So if you have a brush like this one, like for instance, you can see that now I cannot brush behind that. And then the reason for that is that I'm calling this code only the first time, not every time it's redrawn. So I'm actually going to be moving some of these things. And then let's say that I'm going to put it in here, brush this. And then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a function called update brush. And this function is going to take the selection and the data, because I'm going to pass that to my update that I'm going to show you in a minute. And then all of this, I'm going to put it inside that. So basically it's going to take the brush, it's going to change the extent, make sure that the brush is in there, and then I have this element, and this is going to do something with the selection and the data. So now I have this one too, so I can move that one as well inside, and then I can say that I'm going to take my selection and then select my brush, that is just the G that I created in here, and then in there I just do the call brush, okay? And this function I'm going to be calling in here, and here is where all the updates are happening. You can see that this is updating the domains, or for the scales. This is creating the transition, this is changing the axis, I guess, and these are the marks. So let's do another one that is like update brush, and then I need to pass the selection and the data. I actually had a bug before where I wasn't passing, and you need to do that because these two variables only exist in there, okay? So I had a bug before where I wasn't passing this, and therefore, like when I was importing, it was accessing the overall data from the original one, and it was very difficult to figure that out. So now that we have this, then we can start playing with this. So going back to brushed, this is where we're going to be doing this. Actually, now that we have that, then we can organize this way. So that way, at least this one is not complaining that it doesn't exist. So if you have a selection, then the first thing you need to figure out is from where to where. So what we can do is that we can say that we get the x0 and y0 points, and then x1 and y1 points, and that is just going to be by attribute disaggregation or whatever that's called on this. Then what we can do is that we can create a filtered data, and this is going to be data.filter, and then I am going to filter on d.x attribute has to be bigger than x of x0. So I'm selecting from here, so I'm selecting everything that is above this. And it has to be, it also has to be less or equal, less or equal, and in here it should be greater or equal than x of x1, okay? And, beautiful. And then I need to have two more, and this one is going to be y attribute. Actually, I'm too lazy, so I'm just going to do it like this. And then basically this is going to be for y. So I do y attribute, y. This has to be passed. And notice that I'm actually, oh yes, I'm making the same mistake I did before. So actually, it should be the other way around. So actually, this data is the one that it's coming on the format or the domain of the data. And then the x0 and x1, if you actually look at that on the console, I'm going to save you the time, it's coming on pixels. So actually, what you need to do is go from the data to pixels, so then we use our scales. So the other way around, it creates a very weird bug where you're selecting something really strange. And the reason for that is because you're actually taking the pixels and converting them into pixels again, which is really messed up. So now that I have this, let's say that I want to see if my selection is changing, and then I can just say here's my filter data, And then very important for this thing to reload, I actually have to recall this one, that is the one that it's redrawing everything. And then I can come in here on the console and see that, wow, it's working. Cannot believe it. Good, perfect, so far so good. Now I just need a visual cue. I need a couple more things. I need a visual cue showing me what are the elements that are selected. So what I could do, and this is a trick that took me a lot of time to understand, and is the following. So if you inside here, you go and say, I'm going to take my marks, and actually you don't even need to go to the marks. Let's try directly with the item. You see, here is where I'm binding the data to my marks, so directly with the item. So what you can do in here is that I can say, I'm going to select the data, like I'm going to grab the same selection. And because in here, the data binding has already happened, then when you do that, you're selecting that you're picking that selection with the data binded to it. So that is super powerful because you now can filter. And then we can use exactly the same function to filter also the selection. I don't think that is the most efficient way of doing it, but let's go with that for the moment. So let's say, let's call this is selected, and then save that as a function. And then, so I don't have to repeat my code, so I actually call it in here, and call it in here twice. So now that I have done that, then you can change the style and say that the filling of this is going to be Firebreak or red, or if you want. So having done that, you can also do this in here and then say that for those, like basically what the trick that this one is doing is that it will select them all, then it's going to make them all blue, and then it's going to select the selected and or pick the selected, filter the selected, and then paint them on red. So hopefully now then you see I do have a weird bug in there, probably in my filter selection. Yes, so this one should be like this. If I wanted to actually achieve that, I'm sure I wouldn't have been able to. So now I have that, and now the only thing I have missing, I have two more things. Like first one is that I need to remember the ID. So I'm going to say my ID, it's going to be just ID. And then, or actually I'm going to start this on null. And then the ID, you need to assign that where it as the second attribute of the data binding that you're using. So in this case in here, we can say that the ID function is going to be taking two parameters. And then if ID is different than null, then you return d.id. And if it is equal to null, then you just return the I. That it's kind of the default behavior, okay? So having done that, then you will need an accessor for ID, and that you do it in here. So you say the function is going to check if someone calls the getter setter ID, then I check if it has any arguments. If it doesn't, then I return the current ID. But if it does, then I assign whatever parameter you pass in here to my ID. Okay, so remember that is a standard getter setter. And that is the first thing. The second thing we need to do is that we need to have another property that is going to be our brush. In this case, this is going to be a function that doesn't do anything. That is kind of like the default. Or actually, if you want, you can say, excuse me, like you can put here filtered, and then we can create a function that actually, like the default behavior will be for it to print it on the console. But then I will do the same thing. So what I will do in here is that I will take that function and I will pass the filter data. Okay, so for the moment it will only put it in the console. But I will let the person that uses this module override that. And then the way I do that, it's exactly the same thing. So I create another accessor. So, and I do that with ID, as you see in here. So as you can see, basically I'm doing that for X and for Y, and also for the width and the height. Very important that you return the chart, so that way you can actually do chain methods. So having done that, I think this should be enough. I hope you are all crossing your fingers, and then we can enable link sharing, and hopefully with that link sharing I can come, which one is the one I was doing, to where are we here, this one. So instead of loading from there, I'm actually going to be loading from here, so that one doesn't work. And then I think this is the way you have to do it, by ID. And then we have our chart, and fingers crossed, yeah, it works. So that's how I created that. So like when you're creating coordinated views, like that's the basic way of doing that. If you want to create layer views, that is very easy. You just put another mark on top of the previous one, like basically in here, not that one, but this one maybe. Remember that I was creating my circles in here, so you can just pass and create another one on top of that. So that will be how you do layer. In here we are using the same idiom. So remember these coordinated views, when you have the same idiom, share data, you can have different representations, so you can do that also, forking the other example and then creating different versions. So this is an example on how to create coordinated views with D3 and how to create brushes. I hope you have enjoyed.